Hey, it's November 2nd, 2025, and it is my 2-year anniversary on testosterone. Yay! Uh, as you can see, I've had a lot of hair growth this year. But the main point of these videos that I've been doing is to document my voice change. So I'm going to do another story time. I'm going to be reading a chapter from Gory Details by Erica Engelhout. And this chapter is called Pass the Semen. How blowflies can impact crime scenes. People sometimes ask me, what's the grossest thing you've ever written about? My answer is usually that it depends what you, as a unique human being, find especially gross. Because we're all not equally disgusted by the same things, it follows that you might be most horrified by eyeworms, while others are more repulsed by, say, head transplants. But if you ask about my favorite gross scientific experiment, well, I do have an opinion on that. My nod goes to forensic expert Annalisa Dirtle's experiments feeding bodily fluids to blowflies. Flies' taste in people's juices turns out to be not only a delightfully gross topic, but also surprisingly important for criminal justice. Blowflies, in case you're not familiar with them, are insects of death. These big, shiny insects have an amazing ability to appear, seemingly out of nowhere, within moments of blood being spilled, or at the slightest whiff of decay. As a result, hordes of them are often found buzzing around a gory crime scene. That got Dirtle wondering, with all these flies doing what flies do, flying around and pooping on stuff, what could they be contaminating crime scenes? Could they be contaminating crime scenes? Interestingly, fly poo can look very similar to blood spatter, says Dirtle, a lecturer in forensic science at Australia's Deakin University. Given this, she explains, entomologists occasionally get called in to identify exactly which of the two substances crime scene investigators are contemplating. Even for an expert, it can be hard to tell the two apart. In fact, I saw a presentation at a forensic science conference in which a scientist had resorted to scanning electron microscopy to tell blood from fly poop, because it's so often impossible to distinguish them based on color or shape of the droplets. Confusing them could throw off an analysis of blood spatter patterns, making it look as if blood was spilled during an attack when really a fly just pooped there. Another reason it's important to tell the difference between these substances is that speckles of fly poop could also contain the DNA of the person whose fluids they snacked on, and that person may or may not have been involved in the crime. It turns out that you can get a full human DNA profile from a single piece of fly poo, Dirtle observes. I tend to refer to poo rather than vomit, she clarifies, because, in my experience, flies tend to eat their vomit, and most of what you have left is poo, although they do eat that too. Clearly, blowflies are gross, but could they really incriminate someone by eating bodily fluids? To find out, Dirtle needed to know what blowflies would be likely to eat at a crime scene, so she experimented, offering Australian sheep blowflies a crime scene buffet with bodily fluids collected from volunteers, blood, saliva, and semen, plus other appealingly high protein and high carbohydrate snacks that flies might find in a victim's home, pet food, canned tuna, and even honey. Assembling the buffet involved a bit of delicate collection. Volunteers had blood drawn and spat into a tube to provide saliva samples, and semen donations were self-generated by masturbation into plastic specimen containers and stored at 15 degrees Celsius until required, according to the research paper, which was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2016. Dirtle told me she was eternally grateful to all the volunteers who remain anonymous, particularly the one who had to hide his sample pot in the frozen peas because he knew his stepdad didn't like peas and would never find it there, she says. In any case, the offerings were assembled and placed in little dishes. Next, the hungry flies were released. Dirtle's team recorded each group of flies, including males and females of different ages, on video for at least 6 hours to observe their feeding behaviors and preferences for the various menu items. They say you catch more flies with honey, But in this case, they're wrong. What you catch more flies with, it turns out, is semen. It's the crack cocaine of the fly world, Durdle says. They gorge on it. It makes them drunk. They stumble around, partly paralyzed. I've even seen one fly give up hope of cleaning itself properly and sit down on its bum, she says. Then they gorge some more, and then it kills them. But they die happy. The flies would be perfectly satisfied to eat pet food, blood, or saliva if offered individually. But if semen was an option, most preferred it above all else. As for why semen was such a hit, it may be that flies are particularly drawn to its smell. Flies are attracted to odors associated with decay, which include compounds like cadaverine and putrescine, known chemically as polyamines. And sperm contains related polyamines called spermine and spermidine. A 2016 study published in the journal PLOS Biology found that flies are not only highly attracted to polyamines, but also need them nutritionally. When female flies ate food enriched in polyamines, they laid 3 times more eggs. Another thing semen is full of: DNA. So if a fly stuffs itself with this substance, it's also stuffing itself full of the semen donor's DNA, which the fly could, in theory, expel someplace else. To see if that ever happens, Durdle also tested flies' poop after they'd had their fill of various offerings from her buffet. If the flies had fed on semen or a combination with semen in it, then you got a full human DNA profile almost every time. With blood, it was maybe a third of the time, and with saliva, never. Durdle didn't stop there, as one might expect from a scientist willing to look for semen leftovers in insect poop. Why not also see whether flies prefer dry or wet food, like a finicky cat? It was also interesting to find the flies generally preferred dry blood or semen to wet blood or semen, Durdle says. This could be important because it means flies could continue to cause problems at a scene long after the biological material had dried. In a 2018 study in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, Durdle's team released flies into a house where blood, sugar, and water were the only food sources, then watched to see where the flies would poop. They determined that crime scene investigators should be wary of blood spots found near food sources, particularly in low places, because they could well be fly poop. How big a deal is this? You really need to look at the probabilities, including the chance that a fly might feed on some poor guy's semen after he's had some innocent quiet time to himself, and then fly into a crime scene and poo, potentially incriminating him, Durdle observes. Chillingly, the scenario doesn't sound entirely implausible, and not just in the case of overly enthusiastic teenage boys. A man who innocently left some sperm behind after a sexual encounter might have cause for concern about where his DNA might show up later. There's also the chance, Durdle says, that a forensic investigator could sample fly poop thinking it's blood spatter and discover DNA that's not from the victim. This business with fly poop is just one part of the bigger problem that's starting to crop up in forensic DNA analysis. As technology used to detect DNA has become more sensitive, there's greater risk of finding tiny bits of DNA that got there accidentally, as forensic scientist Cynthia Cale observed in the journal Nature in 2015. Moreover, it doesn't have to be a fly carrying DNA from place to place. Even a handshake can do it. In fact, Cale demonstrated that one person can transfer another's DNA to a knife handle after just 2 minutes of holding hands. If that sounds like a lot of contact, it did to Cale too. So she also experimented with people touching for 60, 30, and 10 seconds. The verdict? DNA transfer was detectable in most cases. Even with as little as 10 seconds of contact, she detected what she calls a contributor inversion, meaning that the majority of the DNA on the knife came from the person who had never actually touched it. And as with flies inadvertently carrying DNA to a crime scene, this could be a real problem. I think the biggest impact might be when a defense lawyer uses it to raise doubt in the mind of a jury, Durdle says. As it happens, there's been at least one case of false accusations based on transferred DNA. In 2013, Lucas Anderson was arrested in California for murder and held for 4 months because his DNA was found under a victim's fingernails. That's pretty incriminating usually, but it turned out that Anderson had an airtight alibi. He was in the hospital exactly when the murder happened, detoxing from a drinking spree. He'd been so drunk, in fact, that at first even Anderson himself wasn't entirely sure whether he'd done it. Eventually, a police officer connected the dots. 3 hours after paramedics hauled Anderson to the hospital, the same team was called to the scene of the murder and handled the victim's body. Somehow, they left a little of Anderson's DNA behind. For now, no one really knows how often mix-ups like this might happen, but it's going to be important to figure that out, says Cliff Spiegelman, a statistician at Texas A&M who specializes in forensic science. There are very few studies, and the right answer is they just don't know, Spiegelman says. Nor is it clear whether anyone has ever been wrongly convicted based on DNA collected from fly poop. It's just clear that it's physically possible, thanks to studies like Dirtles. But the news is not all bad. In fact, it's even conceivable that a fly could help deliver criminal justice. If, for example, it eats bodily fluids from a crime scene, flies into another room and poops there, that poop might preserve a DNA sample and foil a perpetrator's attempts to clean up. What it all comes down to is that forensic investigators need to consider all potential sources of DNA and be extremely careful not to accidentally transfer DNA from one object to another. As for the rest of us, it's a little disconcerting to think that our genetic material can be spread so easily. All we can do is be careful whose hand we shake and watch out for flies.